Photoshop can be customized in a number of ways to make you more efficient and to help you get the results that you want when you're working on images for the web. So I suggest that you take a few minutes up front to customize your panels, your keyboard shortcuts, preferences, and color settings for web work, as I'm going to show you how to do in this chapter. This movie covers customizing the arrangement of panels for web work using the improved workspace switcher in Photoshop CS5. Photoshop offers lots of panels, more than you can possibly fit on the screen all at once. You can control which panels are open and how they're arranged, and you can save that panel configuration for future web work. When I'm setting up my panels for web work, I like to start with one of the preset task-based workspaces that come with Photoshop and that are displayed up here on the right side of the application bar in the workspace switcher. The application bar is a separate bar here on a Mac, and it's part of the menu bar on a PC. The workspace switcher looks slightly different in Photoshop CS5 than it did in the last version of Photoshop. It lists separate workspaces along the application bar, and if I want to see more preset workspaces, I can click on this double line and drag to the left. The workspace switcher is currently set to its default, the Essentials workspace, which sets up the panel configuration that you see here. I'm going to select a different preset workspace, the Design workspace, and as you can see, that changes the panel configuration. I think these particular panels are a reasonable starting point for web work, but I often also use the Layer Comps panel when I'm making rollover buttons for the web, as I'm going to show you how to do later in this course. So I'd like to fine-tune the design preset with which I started by adding the Layer Comps panel. To open a panel, I go up to the Window menu and I choose the panel. I'll choose Layer Comps, and that opens the Layer Comps panel here in this inner column of panels. Another way to fine-tune a preset is to close some of the panels that originally opened. So let's say that I want to close this entire group of panels, the character and paragraph panels, which are used to control type. I'll go to the panel menu icon on the right side of that panel group, click, and from the panel menu, I'll choose Close Tab Group. And that closes both of those panels together. I can also close individual panels. For example, I'm not going to use the Notes panel that opened along with the Layer Comps panel, so I'll click on its tab, and then I'll go to its panel menu, and I'll choose Close. I can not only open and close panels, but I can change the location of panels. Let's say that I want the Layer Comps panel to be at the bottom of the column of panels on the right. I'll click on the Layer Comps panel tab and drag down to the bottom of the column on the right, and when I see a blue line there, I'll release my mouse. Now that I've made some changes to the preset design workspace that I started with, Photoshop will automatically memorize the changes that I've made, so that the design workspace will stay this way, even if I switch to another workspace, like the painting workspace, and then go back to the design workspace, my changes remain. And this is true even if I were to close and reopen Photoshop. This is a new development in Photoshop CS5. It means that I could just stop here, knowing that the design preset will always give me this panel arrangement, which I like to use for web work. But let's say that I like having this panel arrangement for web work, but I still would like to have the original design preset back so that I can use it for print work. In that case, I can save this custom panel configuration separately as a new preset. To do that, I'm going to click on the double-pointed arrow on the right side of the workspace switcher, and I'm going to choose New Workspace. In this window, I'll give my new workspace a name. I'll call this My Web, and that's all I have to do other than click Save in order to save this panel configuration. As you can see, panel locations are automatically saved in this workspace. If I also happen to want to save some keyboard shortcuts or some menu changes along with the panel locations, I could check the appropriate boxes. But I'll leave both of those blank for now, and I'll just click Save. That adds my custom My Web workspace as a new preset in the workspace switcher. Now or any time in the future, if I'm working in a different workspace, I can always get back to the My Web panel configuration by clicking my custom My Web workspace. Remember that I said I also wanted to have the design preset as it was originally so that I can use it for print design work. In CS5, there's a new way to reset a preset workspace to its default. To do that, I'm going to select the design workspace in the workspace switcher, and then I'm going to go to the double-pointed arrow, and I'll choose Reset and the name of the workspace, which is Design. And that sets the panel configuration back as it originally was. Sometimes I create custom workspaces that I later want to delete. Here's how to delete a custom workspace. I have to have any workspace except for the My Web workspace selected, and then I'll go to the double-pointed arrow, and I'll choose Delete Workspace, and then I have a choice of My Web workspace or any of these other workspaces to delete. I'll leave My Web selected, and I'll click Delete, And if I really wanted to delete this workspace, I would click yes, but I'm actually going to click no and cancel because I want to hang on to the My Web workspace for just a minute to show you something else. What if I wanted to edit my custom My Web workspace? All I have to do is click on that workspace and then make a change to my panel configuration. For example, I could select the info panel, which I'm not going to use, and then go to its panel menu and choose close. And now that change is automatically memorized as part of my custom My Web workspace. And there's no need to resave that workspace to keep this change. The Workspace Switcher provides a way for you to save a custom configuration of panels and even keyboard shortcuts and menu changes if you want that suits your way of working with web images or your way of doing any task for that matter. And that allows you to go off and do something else and then restore your custom workspace the next time that you're designing for the web. Many people shy away from using shortcuts in Photoshop, particularly when they first start learning the program. So if that describes you, you're not alone. But as you become more experienced in Photoshop, you'll find that using at least a few keyboard shortcuts for the most common commands that you use will make you more efficient. This is especially true if you're using the same commands over and over as you'll do in your web work. Many of the menu items in Photoshop come with keyboard shortcuts. For example, in the File menu, there are keyboard shortcuts listed to the right of many of the commands, as you can see here. But not all the items in this menu have a keyboard shortcut, and some commands, like the Save for Web and Devices command, which you'll use often in web work, have complicated shortcuts that may be difficult to remember or awkward to use, like this 4-key shortcut that you see here. Fortunately, keyboard shortcuts are customizable in Photoshop, so I can change a keyboard shortcut like this one, and I can add a keyboard shortcut where there is none. For example, if I go up to the Layer menu and down to the New Layer-Based Slice command, which is another command that you'll often use in web work, as I'll explain in another movie in this course, you'll see that there is no keyboard shortcut listed. So let me show you how to create a shortcut for a command like this that doesn't already have one, and how to change an unwieldy shortcut like the Save for Web and Devices shortcut. I'm going to start by going up to the Edit menu and down to Keyboard Shortcuts. Before I make any changes to shortcuts here, I want to preserve the Photoshop default shortcuts in case I want to go back to them. So I'm going to press the second icon to the right of the Set menu to create a new set of shortcuts where I'm going to make my changes. I'll name this new set my Web set, and I'll click the Save button. And now I'm working in the Web set of shortcuts, which is currently an exact copy of the Photoshop defaults. In the Shortcuts For menu, I can choose which shortcuts I want to work with. Shortcuts for tools, for panel menus, or for application menus. Application menus means the menus at the top of the screen, and those are the menus that I'm interested in right now, so I'll leave this set to application menus. Then I'll come down into these categories of application menus, which correspond to the categories in the menu bar at the top of the screen. I'll click the arrow to the left of the File category, and now I can see a list of all of the items in the File menu. I'm going to scroll down to the Save for Web and Devices item. To the right of that command, you can see the complicated 4-key shortcut. I'll click on that shortcut to open its editing field. Instead of this long shortcut, I'd like to try something shorter, say Command plus W on a Mac, which is Control plus W on a PC. So I'll press that key combination, and I find that that happens to be a shortcut that is already in use for a different command. This warning tells me that that shortcut is being used for the File Close command. If I wanted to remove Command or Control W altogether from the Close command and assign it to Save for Web and Devices instead, I would click the Accept button right here, but I'm not going to do that yet. Alternatively, if I wanted to change the shortcut for the Close command to something else first so that Command or Control plus W were free to assign to Save for Web and Devices, I would go down and click this button, Accept and go to Conflict. And there's a third choice, which I want in this case, which is to keep Command or Control plus W as the shortcut for the Close command and find a different command for Save for Web and Devices. So I'm going to click Undo Changes, and that brings back the original 4-key shortcut for Save for Web and Devices. I'll try a different shortcut that's not being used elsewhere, Command plus comma on a Mac, which is Control plus comma on a PC. I'll press that keyboard shortcut, and I don't get a warning, so I'll just go up to the Accept button and click there. And I'm done changing this keyboard shortcut. I'm going to scroll up and click the arrow to the left of the File category to collapse it, and I'm going to expand another category, the Layer category, which corresponds to the Layer menu at the top of the screen. Here are all the menu items in the Layer category. I'll scroll all the way down to the new layer-based slice command. And as you can see, this command has no shortcut assigned to it yet. To add a shortcut, I'll click in the blank space to the right of the command to open the editing window, and I'm going to press a keyboard shortcut, the F5 function key on my keyboard, to try to assign that to this command. Again, I get a warning telling me that the F5 function key is already in use as a keyboard shortcut. It's being used to open the brush panel from the window menu. I don't mind accepting this change because I'm not going to be opening the brush panel much. So I'm just going to click Accept, and that removes the F5 shortcut from the brush command and assigns it to the new layer-based slice command, which I'm going to use more often in my web work. There's one more step, which is to save both the changes that I've made to my web set of keyboard shortcuts. To do that, I'll click the Save Set icon right here, and finally I'll click OK to close the Keyboard Shortcuts and Menus dialog box. Now let's take a look at the changes that I've made to the menus in Photoshop. In the File menu, down at Save for Web and Devices, you can see that the shortcut has been changed to Command, comma on the Mac. That's Control, comma on the PC. If I move off that menu and go up to the Layer menu, and down to the new layer-based slice command, you can see that it now has a shortcut, the F5 function key, where it had no shortcut before. So again, I realize that not everyone likes to use keyboard shortcuts, particularly if you're just learning Photoshop. But when and if you're ready to use shortcuts for your web work, make things easy on yourself by customizing the web-related shortcuts that I've shown you here, as well as any others that you find yourself using often. Photoshop's preferences offer a way for you to customize some basic functions in Photoshop. If most of the work you do in Photoshop is on images for the web, I suggest that you change at least one preference, the preference for units of measurement, from inches to pixels, to correspond to the way that images are displayed on screen. This will ensure that Photoshop's rulers are set to pixels by default. You might also want to change the preference that controls the color of Photoshop's guides to make them easier to see. Before I show you how to change those preferences, let me open Photoshop's horizontal and vertical rulers to show them to you. I'll make my rulers visible by going to the application bar and clicking on the View Extras menu and choosing Show Rulers. The rulers are useful for measuring, of course, but also for positioning items in a web composition. You can see that my rulers are currently measuring in inches, which is the default unit of measurement in Photoshop. I could change the rulers to pixels on the fly by control-clicking, that's right-clicking on a PC, on either of the rulers and choosing pixels from the pop-up menu. If I ever need to switch back to inches, for example, if I were working on a print job, I could do that on the fly the same way. However, if most of what I do is working with images for the web or screen, it's more efficient to start with my rulers set to pixels by default. For that, I'll modify a preference. To change a preference on a Mac, I'll go to the Photoshop menu. On a PC, that's the Edit menu, and choose Preferences, and I can choose a subcategory of preferences from here if I wish, or just start with General Preferences. In the Preferences dialog box, I'll go to the Units and Rulers category, and then I'll move over to the Rulers menu and change it from its default of inches to pixels, and I'll click OK. Now you can see that my rulers are set to pixels, and every time I open my rulers, they'll start set to pixels unless I go in and change the preference back to inches. When I have my rulers open, I also have access to guides. Guides are useful for positioning and measuring as I'm laying out a web page. To create a guide, I can go to either the horizontal ruler or the vertical ruler and click and drag to bring out a guide and drop it wherever I want. And I can drag out more than one guide. And I can do that from either ruler. By default, the guides are cyan. If that color doesn't show up clearly against a particular image, you can change the color in Preferences. To do that, I'll go back to Photoshop on the Mac or Edit on the PC and choose Preferences, and this time I'm going to choose my subcategory from this menu. I'll choose Guides, Grid, and Slices. I'll move to the Guides area and to the Color menu, and I'll change the color. In this case, I might choose green rather than cyan. I can also change the style of the guide lines if I prefer dashed lines, but I'm going to leave this as solid lines for now. And, by the way, I can change the color of other elements in this area, Smart Guides, Grid, and Slices. I'll leave everything else at its defaults for now and click OK. And as you can see, my guidelines have changed color to green. While we're on the subject of rulers and guides, a few words about how to use them. You can adjust the origin point of the rulers by clicking in the top left corner of the document window and dragging to wherever you want the 0, 0 points to be. So now 0 on the horizontal ruler is here and 0 on the vertical ruler is here, and that will help me to measure the size of this photograph. If I want to put the ruler's origin points back to their default location, I'll double-click in the top left corner of the document window. Guides can be useful for showing you where you are on the ruler. This horizontal guide is now pointing to the 160 mark on the vertical ruler. I can make my guides temporarily invisible by going to the View Extras menu on the application bar and unchecking Show Guides. To bring my guides back, I'll go back to that menu and choose Show Guides. If I want to delete one of the guides, I'll select the Move tool in the toolbox. I'll hover over the guide until I see the double-pointed arrow, and then I'll click and drag off the canvas to remove that guide. If I want to remove all of the guides, I'll go up to the View menu at the top of the screen and I'll choose Clear Guides. And now all my guides are gone permanently. As you can see, rulers and guides can be very useful when you're designing a web page layout or working on another kind of web image. But just be sure that when you are designing for the web, you first set the ruler's preference to pixels in Photoshop's preferences. It's always best if the colors in an image look similar to you when you're preparing the image in Photoshop, as those colors will look to your viewers when they see the image later in their web browsers. The best way to accomplish that is to emulate in your copy of Photoshop the way that colors will appear in a typical web browser on a typical computer monitor. So before you work on any images for the web, take the time to configure Photoshop's color settings with that goal in mind, as I'll show you how to do now. To access Photoshop's color settings, I'll go to the Edit menu and I'll choose Color Settings. There are lots of controls here. Fortunately, I don't have to set each one of the fields in this dialog box individually. Instead, I'll go up to the Settings menu and I'll choose an umbrella preset that affects multiple fields in this dialog box. For web work, I suggest choosing North America General Purpose 2, even over this choice, North America Web Internet. As I said, that preset controls the other fields in this dialog box. The most critical of those is the RGB working space, which determines the characteristics of the color environment in which RGB images will be displayed in my copy of Photoshop as I'm working on them. The preset I chose changed the RGB working space to sRGB. sRGB is the best choice for web work because it's the working space that most closely resembles the color characteristics of a typical PC monitor, which is what most viewers use to surf the web today. It's true that sRGB contains a relatively narrow range of colors as compared to broader color spaces that are used for print work, like Adobe RGB, Color Match RGB, and ProPhoto RGB. But the narrower range of colors in sRGB is what the typical web viewer will see on his or her monitor, so that's the color setup that I want to emulate in my copy of Photoshop. The only one of these working spaces that I'm interested in right now is the RGB working space. That's because images for the web have to be in RGB color mode. Web browsers can't display CMYK or grayscale images, so I'll skip over those settings. Next, I'll check the color management policies here, in particular the RGB color management policy. Choosing the umbrella setting North America General Purpose 2, set the RGB color management policy to preserve embedded profiles. This refers to the fact that a description of the color environment, called a color profile, can be attached to an image when the image is saved. Preserve embedded profiles means that if I happen to open an image that was saved with a color profile that's different than my sRGB working space, say Adobe RGB, then Photoshop will respect that other color profile, in this case Adobe RGB, and won't try to change it. And because all of these checkboxes are unchecked due to the North America General Purpose preset, when I do open a mismatched image, Photoshop won't force me to make some decision about color management at that point. It will just open the image. Now that I've changed my color settings for the web, I'll click OK. And I'm now working in the sRGB working space. So that's the first step in a color managed workflow for the web. Now, let's say I happen to open an image that I'm preparing for a website that doesn't match my sRGB working space. In other words, an image that's been tagged with a color profile other than sRGB. Here, for example, is an image that was created in an Adobe RGB color environment, and the creator saved it with the Adobe RGB profile, as I can see down here in the Document Information area. If you can't see that, you can press this arrow and choose Document Profile. Another indication that I have a mismatch between the profile attached to this image and my working space is the fact that there's an asterisk up here next to the bit depth in the title bar of the document window. My next step with a non-matching image like this one is to convert the image to sRGB so that it does match the sRGB working space. If I'm going to edit the image here in Photoshop proper, I can convert it to sRGB by choosing Edit, Convert to Profile, and then setting the destination space profile to sRGB. But I'm not going to do that now because I want to show you another way to convert an image to sRGB. So I'll cancel out of this dialog box. Let's say that I have no edits to make to this image. All I want to do is to make a copy of this PSD file in a web-ready format like JPEG and optimize it for display on the web. In that case, it's quicker and easier to convert the image to sRGB while I'm optimizing. To do that, I'll go to the File menu at the top of the screen and choose Save for Web and Devices. This opens this big Save for Web and Devices window where there are lots of settings. I'm going to address this window in great detail in later chapters. For now, it's enough to know that on the left is the original PSD image, and on the right, there's a preview of the image as it will look optimized for the web. The colors in the Adobe RGB original look rather washed out in my sRGB working environment. But the colors in the optimized preview on the right don't. That's because by default, this Convert to sRGB command is checked, so that the preview on the right displays how the image will look converted to sRGB. If I uncheck that, here's how the image would look without conversion, rather dull like the original, and here's how it looks with conversion. So I do want to leave this checked. Another thing to keep in mind is that images often appear darker and sometimes bluer on a PC than they do on a Mac because the gamma of the two platforms is different. So it's also a good idea to use the preview menu here to check how the image might look on a Mac versus on a PC. By default, the preview menu is set to represent my particular monitor, but if I want to see how the optimized preview would look on a typical Mac, I'll click there and choose Legacy Macintosh. In this case, it's very similar to my monitor because I am working on a Mac. And if I change that menu to Internet Standard RGB, you can see that the image looks darker as it might on a typical PC monitor. These previews are just approximations, but if they reveal significant shifts in color, brightness, and image detail, especially on the platform that most of my viewers are going to be on, I could always click Cancel to close the Save for Web and Devices window, go back into Photoshop, make some exposure or color corrections there to compensate, and then reopen the Save for Web and Devices window to optimize the corrected image. For now, I'll go up here and set my preview back to monitor color, which is the default setting. One more thing here related to color management. I'll usually leave Embed Color Profile checked, which is the default behavior here. This ensures that the sRGB color profile to which I'm converting the optimized version of this file will be embedded in the saved image. There are a few web browsers that can read color profiles like that, so attaching the profile ensures that the colors in the image will be displayed properly in those web browsers. The downside of embedding a color profile in an image for the web is that will increase file size very slightly. But that increase in file size isn't very significant in most cases, so as a general rule, I do leave Embed Color Profile checked, in the expectation that more web browsers will be able to read color profiles as time goes on. Now, assuming that I've set all the rest of the controls in this window as I want them, I'll save the optimized copy of this file for the web, as you'll see me do many times in this course, by clicking the Save button, and in the Save Optimize As window, navigating to where I want to save, and then clicking the Save button. And I've saved a file that's been converted to sRGB and to which I've attached the sRGB color profile for any web browser that can read it. So the lesson is that when you're trying to manage color in your web images, first do go to Photoshop's color settings and choose sRGB as the working space. Then if you do happen to open an image that's tagged with a profile other than sRGB, convert that image to sRGB, which is done most easily in the Save for Web and Devices window. This is the best way to match the colors that your viewers will see in your image on the web to the colors that you've seen in the image as you've been working on it in Photoshop.